Hi, I'm Zara. 3 months ago, my father-in-law looked me dead in the eye during our anniversary dinner and said, "You're worthless, and everyone at this table knows it." My husband sat there in silence while his mother nodded in agreement. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just excused myself and walked out of Ridgefield Manor with nothing but my dignity intact. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But yesterday morning, I watched from my loft window as moving trucks emptied Harold Blackwood's estate, while he stood on the sidewalk holding a single suitcase. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who fall the hardest when the truth finally comes to light. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table, each flicker highlighting the tension that had become as familiar as the expensive china we ate from every Sunday. Harold Blackwood sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his domain, his gray hair perfectly styled, his suit pressed to perfection. At 68, he still commanded every room he entered, and tonight was no different. Constance, my mother-in-law, perched beside him with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of silent agreement. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she nodded along to whatever Harold was saying about quarterly projection. Alex sat across from me, his phone buzzing incessantly against the polished wood. Even during our third wedding anniversary dinner, Blackwood Technologies demanded his attention. I watched his jaw tighten with each notification, knowing he was calculating stock prices and merger timelines instead of celebrating the woman he'd married. The irony wasn't lost on me that in a house worth $12 million, I felt more invisible than I ever had in my cramped studio apartment before our marriage. I had been quiet for most of the evening, picking at the salmon that Mrs. Delacroix had prepared with her usual perfection. The silence wasn't unusual. Harold had made it clear from the beginning that my opinions weren't welcome at family discussions, especially those involving business. As a former art curator turned freelance consultant, I apparently lacked the sophistication necessary to understand the complexities of their empire. The fact that I had successfully managed 3 major gallery exhibitions and had my master's degree from Columbia meant nothing to a man who measured worth exclusively in dollar signs. Harold's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. Constance was just telling me about the Mitchell's daughter. She's engaged to that pharmaceutical executive from Seattle. Now there's a woman who understands her value to a family. His pale blue eyes found mine across the table and I felt my stomach clench. It's refreshing to see young women who know how to contribute meaningfully to their husband's success. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Alex's typing slowed, but he didn't look up from his screen. Constance reached for her wine glass, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I set down my fork carefully, the soft clink against the plate unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "I think art and culture have their place in society," I said evenly, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. "Not everything valuable can be measured in profit margins." Harold's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Art," he repeated, drawing out the word like it tasted bitter. "How quaint. Tell me, Zara, what exactly has your appreciation for pretty pictures contributed to this family? To our legacy?" He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, abandoning the proper posture he usually demanded from everyone else. "Alex works 18-hour days building something that matters. Constance has been the backbone of our social connections for decades. Even our housekeeper provides more tangible value than your little hobby." The insult landed exactly where he intended. I felt my cheeks flush, but I kept my voice level. "My work isn't a hobby, Harold. I've built relationships with collectors and institutions across the country. I've helped establish cultural programs that generate what income now." He interrupted, his voice rising just enough to let me know he was enjoying this. "What measurable return on investment? What doors have you opened for Alex that he couldn't have opened himself?" He sat back, crossing his arms with the satisfaction of someone delivering a killing blow. "You're worthless, and everyone at this table knows it." The words hit me like a physical force. I felt my breath catch, my hands trembling slightly against the linen napkin in my lap. I looked at Alex, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything that would show he valued what I brought to our marriage. Instead, his fingers continued their steady rhythm across his phone screen, as if the conversation was happening in another room entirely. Constance nodded slowly, her pearl earrings catching the light as she tilted her head in what might have been sympathy but felt more like pity. "Harold's right, dear," she said softly, her cultured voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Marriage is about partnership, about building something together. We've been patient, but after 3 years," she trailed off, letting the implication settle like dust over everything beautiful in the room. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. My hands were steady now, my voice calm. "Excuse me," I said, placing my napkin beside my untouched dessert. I seemed to have lost my appetite. I walked out of that dining room with my head high, past the oil paintings that Harold had purchased not for their beauty but for their resale value, past the marble sculptures that served as conversation pieces rather than sources of wonder. I collected my purse from the foyer table, slipped on my coat, and stepped into the October evening without looking back. The drive back to our penthouse took 23 minutes, long enough for me to replay every word of the conversation, every silence where Alex should have spoken, every nod from Constance that felt like a nail in the coffin of my place in their family. I parked in our private garage and took the elevator to the 40th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Portland that still took my breath away even after 3 years of calling it home. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the wine refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic far below. I poured myself a glass of the Pinot Noir that Alex and I had brought back from our honeymoon in Napa, back when he still looked at me like I was something precious rather than something he had acquired. The irony of drinking wine worth more than most people's rent while being told I was worthless wasn't lost on me. I sat on our Italian leather sofa, still wearing my anniversary dress, still wearing the diamond earrings Alex had given me that morning, with a distracted kiss and a promise that next year would be different, that next year he'd be less busy, more present. The earrings felt heavy now, like tiny anchors pulling me down into the depths of a marriage that was drowning in other people's expectations. My phone remained silent for the first hour. No text from Alex asking if I was okay, no call to apologize for his father's cruelty or his own complicity in it. Just the glow of city lights against the windows and the steady tick of the grandfather clock that Constance had insisted we display in our living room because it had been in the Blackwood family for generations. When Alex finally came home at nearly midnight, his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it during stressful phone calls, he found me exactly where I had been since 9 o'clock. He looked surprised to see me awake, as if he had expected me to simply disappear into our bedroom and pretend the evening had never happened. "You left early," he said, hanging his jacket on the back of a dining chair instead of in the closet where it belonged. It was such a small act of disorder from a man who lived his life in perfectly organized compartments. "I left appropriately," I replied, not moving from the sofa. "Your father made his feelings quite clear." Alex loosened his tie completely and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter his mother had given us as a wedding gift. "Dad's old-fashioned. He doesn't understand what you do." The casual dismissal in his voice, the way he reduced 3 years of systematic belittlement to a generational misunderstanding, made something inside me crystallize into perfect, cold clarity. "And you?" I asked. "Do you understand what I do?" He paused with the glass halfway to his lips, finally looking at me directly for the first time since he'd walked through the door. "Of course I do. You're talented, Zara. You have good taste." Good taste. As if I were a decorator he had hired to arrange his life rather than the woman he had promised to love and honor. As if 3 years of marriage had taught him nothing about my passion for discovering emerging artists, my skill at navigating the complex relationships between collectors and galleries, my ability to see potential where others saw only pretty pictures. "Your father called me worthless tonight," I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care. "In front of your mother, in front of you, and you said nothing." Alex drained half his scotch in one swallow. He was frustrated. "The Henderson deal fell through today. He wasn't himself." "No," I said, standing up and facing him across the expanse of our living room that suddenly felt like a chasm. "He was exactly himself. And so were you." I walked past him toward our bedroom, past the wedding photos where we looked so happy, so sure that love would be enough to bridge the gap between his world and mine. At the doorway, I paused without turning around. "I'm going to stay at the riverside for a few days. I need some space to think." "Zara, that's not necessary. We can work this out." But his voice already sounded distant, distracted. I could practically hear him calculating whether this conversation would interfere with his morning meetings, whether my temporary absence would cause complications for the quarterly board review he had mentioned over dinner. "Maybe we can," I said, "but not tonight." I packed a single suitcase with clothes for a week, my laptop and the leather portfolio that contained my current project proposals. I didn't take the jewelry Alex had given me or the designer dresses that Constance had helped me select for charity gala. I took the things that belonged to the woman I had been before I became a Blackwood, before I learned to measure my worth in other people's approval. The Riverside Motel sat on the east side of Portland, far from the gleaming towers of downtown and even farther from the manicured lawns of Ridgefield Manor. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask questions about why someone might need that kind of arrangement. The night clerk, a tired-looking woman with graying hair and kind eyes, handed me a key attached to a plastic tag shaped like a fish. "Room 27, she said. "Ice machines at the end of the hall, and there's a decent coffee shop across the street that opens at 6. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old cigarettes that no amount of air freshener could quite mask. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern that had probably once been cheerful, and the single window looked out onto the parking lot where a neon sign buzzed and flickered against the October sky. It was nothing like the luxury I had grown accustomed to as Alex's wife, but it felt more honest somehow, more real than the polished perfection of our penthouse. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop, staring at the screensaver photo of Alex and me at our wedding reception. We looked so young, so certain that the differences in our backgrounds were romantic rather than problematic. I had been charmed by his intensity, his dedication to building something meaningful. He had been fascinated by my passion for art, my ability to see beauty in unexpected places. Neither of us had anticipated how difficult it would be to maintain those individual identities within the suffocating embrace of family expectations. I closed the laptop and lay back against the thin pillows, still wearing my anniversary dress.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Still tasting the expensive wine on my lips. Outside, I could hear the occasional car passing on the wet streets, the distant sound of late-night conversations from other rooms. It was the kind of ordinary human noise that never penetrated the thick walls and triple-paned windows of our penthouse, and I found it strangely comforting. My phone buzzed once around 2 in the morning. A text from Alex. "Let me know you're safe." I typed back, "I'm safe." There was no response, and I hadn't expected one. Alex was probably already asleep, his phone charging on the nightstand beside our king-sized bed, his mind already organizing tomorrow's priority. I wondered if he would even notice the empty space beside him, or if my absence would simply become another item on his mental checklist, something to be addressed when time permitted. I didn't sleep much that first night. Instead, I lay in the unfamiliar darkness and thought about the woman I had been before I became Mrs. Alexander Blackwood. She had been confident in her abilities, certain of her worth, unafraid to challenge assumptions or fight for what she believed in. Somewhere in the process of trying to fit into Alex's world, that woman had been worn down by 1,000 small compromises, eroded by the constant pressure to be less than she was so that others could feel more important. Harold's words echoed in my mind. "You're worthless, and everyone at this table knows it." The cruelty of the statement was obvious, but what haunted me more was the silence that had followed it. Alex's continued typing, Constance's knowing nod, the absence of any voice raised in my defense. It wasn't the first time I had been dismissed or diminished in that house, but it was the first time the dismissal had been so absolute, so final. As dawn began to filter through the thin curtains, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop waiting for other people to recognize my worth. I was going to stop shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were too small for who I really was. And I was going to find out exactly why Harold Blackwood was so confident that everyone at his table agreed with his assessment of my value. I had learned enough about the Blackwood family dynamics over 3 years to know that nothing in that house happened without calculation. Harold's attack hadn't been spontaneous cruelty born of a bad business day. It had been strategic, designed to accomplish something specific. The question was what, and why now? I opened my laptop and began to research, starting with the Henderson deal that Alex had mentioned as the source of his father's frustration. It took me less than an hour to find the public records showing that Henderson Properties had indeed pulled out of a major development project with Blackwood Properties, citing concerns about environmental impact assessments and community opposition. The withdrawal had cost Harold's company approximately $15 million in projected revenue and had apparently triggered a cascade of other problems. As I dug deeper into the financial reports and news articles, a pattern began to emerge. Blackwood Properties was not as stable as the family liked to project. Harold had overextended himself on several high-risk developments, betting that Portland's real estate boom would continue indefinitely. When the Henderson deal collapsed, it had exposed vulnerabilities that went far beyond a single lost contract. I cross-referenced the timeline of Harold's increasing hostility toward me with the financial pressures his company had been facing. The correlation was impossible to ignore. As his business problems had mounted over the past 18 months, his treatment of me had become progressively worse. What I had interpreted as personal dislike was actually something more calculated. Harold needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the family's problems, someone whose removal might somehow solve the larger issues at stake. The realization hit me like cold water. Harold wasn't just expressing his opinion about my worth to the family. He was actively trying to drive me away, to create enough tension in my marriage that Alex would be forced to choose between his wife and his father's approval. And based on Alex's silence at dinner, that strategy was working exactly as Harold had planned. I saved my research to an encrypted folder and closed the laptop. Outside, the coffee shop across the street was beginning to show signs of life, and I could smell the first hints of brewing coffee drifting through the thin walls of the motel. I had spent the night uncovering the mechanics of my own systematic erasure, and now I needed to decide what to do with that knowledge. The old me, the woman who had learned to make herself smaller to keep the peace, would have confronted Alex privately, hoping he would finally stand up to his father and defend our marriage. She would have believed that love and reason would eventually triumph over family politics and financial pressure. But that woman had been told she was worthless by a man who had never bothered to learn her name until she became useful to his plan. She had watched her husband sit in silence while his father delivered that verdict. She had spent 3 years trying to earn acceptance from people who had decided from the beginning that she would never be enough. I was not that woman anymore. I showered in the tiny bathroom with its cracked tile and temperamental water pressure, put on jeans and a sweater that belonged to the life I was reclaiming rather than the identity I had been performing, and walked across the street to buy the first cup of coffee I had purchased with my own money in longer than I cared to admit. The barista, a young man with paint-stained fingers and an art school sweatshirt, smiled when he handed me my order. "Rough night?" he asked, not unkindly. "Enlightening night," I replied, surprising myself with the truth of it. I sat at a small table by the window and watched Portland wake up around me. Construction workers heading to job sites, nurses finishing late shifts, students carrying backpacks and dreams, real people living real lives, unencumbered by the suffocating weight of other people's expectations or the exhausting performance of being someone they were not. My phone buzzed with another text from Alex. "Dad wants to talk. Can you come by the office this afternoon?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing my response. "I'm busy today." It was the first time in 3 years that I had refused a summons from the Blackwood family, and it felt like stepping off a cliff into open air, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I spent the morning in the coffee shop, reaching out to contacts I had neglected during my marriage, art dealers and gallery owners who had worked with me before I became Alex's wife. I crafted careful emails explaining that I was expanding my consulting practice and would be available for new projects. I updated my professional website, removing the references to my married name and the formal photographs that Constance had insisted would be more appropriate for someone in my position. By noon, I had received 3 responses expressing interest in potential collaboration. One was from a gallery in Seattle that specialized in emerging Pacific Northwest artists. Another came from a collector in San Francisco, who was looking for someone to help him establish a foundation for arts education. The third was from my former mentor at Columbia, who had heard about an opening for a curator position at a prestigious museum in Chicago. Each message represented a door opening back into the world I had abandoned to become the woman Alex needed me to be. Each opportunity was a reminder that my worth had never been dependent on Harold Blackwood's approval or Alex's willingness to defend me. I had allowed myself to be diminished not because I lacked value, but because I had stopped believing in my own power to create meaning and beauty in the world. That afternoon, while Alex was presumably explaining to his father why his wife was too busy to accept his gracious invitation to be further humiliated, I drove to the Portland Art Museum. I hadn't been there in over a year, not since the last time Harold had made one of his cutting remarks about my tendency to waste time on impractical pursuits. As I walked through the galleries, surrounded by the work of artists who had dared to believe that their vision mattered, I felt something inside me uncurl and stretch toward the light. In the contemporary wing, I stopped in front of a painting by a young artist, whose work I had championed early in my career. The piece had been acquired by the museum 2 years ago, and seeing it displayed with the reverence it deserved brought tears to my eyes. The artist had sent me a handwritten note when the purchase was announced, thanking me for believing in her work when no one else would take the risk. That letter was in a box somewhere in our penthouse, filed away with other mementos from my professional life that I had put aside to focus on being a better wife, a more acceptable daughter-in-law. But the impact of that relationship, the ripple effects of my decision to support emerging talent, lived on in museums and private collections across the country. Harold could dismiss my contributions as worthless, but the evidence of my value was hanging on walls where thousands of people could see it, experience it, be moved by it. I sat on a bench in front of the painting for a long time, remembering who I had been before I learned to measure my worth in other people's approval. The woman who had discovered this artist had been fearless in her convictions, unwilling to compromise her vision to fit someone else's narrow definition of success. She had built relationships based on mutual respect and shared passion rather than social obligation and financial advantage. As the museum prepared to close, I made my way back to the parking garage with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had spent the day reconnecting with the professional identity I had set aside for marriage, and the contrast with my life as a Blackwood was stark and undeniable. In my own world I was respected, valued, sought after for my expertise and insight. In Harold's world I was an inconvenience to be managed, a problem to be solved, a person whose existence diminished rather than enhanced the family's reputation. The choice between those two realities should have been simple, but I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. Despite everything that had happened, despite his silence at dinner and his inability to stand up to his father, I still loved Alex. The question was whether the man I had married still existed beneath the layers of family obligation and business pressure, or whether he had been so thoroughly absorbed into Harold's empire that there was nothing left of him to save. I drove back to the riverside as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I had fallen in love with Portland in the first place. The beauty was still there, waiting to be noticed by anyone willing to look up from their phone or their profit margins long enough to see it. In my motel room, I opened my laptop and began to write. Not a business email or a project proposal, but something more personal and immediate. I wrote about the woman I had been before I became afraid of taking up too much space, about the dreams I had deferred to make room for other people's ambition, about the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when you spend too long trying to earn love from people who have already decided you're unworthy of it. As I wrote, my phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Alex asking when I was coming home, from Constance wondering if I needed anything, even from Harold's assistant, requesting my presence at a family meeting to discuss recent misunderstanding. But I ignored them all, lost in the process of rediscovering my own voice after years of learning to speak in other people's language. By the time I finished writing, it was nearly midnight. I had filled 12 pages with observations and insights that felt raw and true and entirely my own. It wasn't meant for publication or professional use. It was simply the act of a woman remembering who she was beneath all the roles she had learned to play. I saved the document and closed the laptop, then lay back against the pillows that smelled like industrial detergent and other people's dreams. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to return to my marriage or to walk away entirely. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth. And Harold Blackwood's opinion was not part of that equation. The morning light filtering through the motel curtains felt different on my second day away from the penthouse. Sharper somehow, like everything had come into focus overnight. I had slept better than I had in months, despite the thin mattress and the distant hum of traffic. There was something liberating about waking up in a space that belonged entirely to me, even if it was temporary and smelled faintly of disinfectant. I made coffee using the small machine on the dresser, the kind with individual packets that produced something barely resembling the Ethiopian blend that Alex's assistant had delivered to our apartment every week. But this coffee was mine, paid for with my own money, consumed without the weight of anyone's expectations pressing down on my shoulders. My phone showed 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. I scrolled through them while sipping the mediocre coffee, noting the escalating tone of urgency in each communication. Alex's messages had progressed from concerned to frustrated to what I recognized as his particular brand of controlled panic. Constance's texts maintained their veneer of polite concern, while making it increasingly clear that my absence was creating complications for upcoming social obligations. Harold, characteristically, had not reached out directly, but his assistant had sent 3 formal requests for my attendance at various family functions. I deleted them all without responding. Instead, I opened my laptop and continued the research I had started the night before. Harold's financial difficulties were more extensive than I had initially discovered. Blackwood Properties wasn't just facing problems with the Henderson deal. A deeper dive into public records revealed a pattern of over-leveraging that went back almost 2 years. Harold had been borrowing against future developments to fund current projects, creating a house of cards that was finally beginning to collapse. The most interesting discovery was a series of meetings between Harold and Vincent Kane, a notorious real estate developer known for his willingness to cut corners and exploit regulatory loopholes. Kane's involvement suggested that Harold was desperate enough to consider partnerships that would have been beneath his consideration in better times. The Blackwood name had always been associated with prestige and ethical business practices, at least publicly. An alliance with someone like Kane would tarnish that reputation irreparably. I cross-referenced the dates of these meetings with Harold's increasingly hostile behavior toward me. The correlation was undeniable. As his business problems had worsened, his treatment of me had become more systematic, more calculated. He wasn't just expressing personal dislike, he was executing a strategy designed to remove me from the family equation before his financial problems became public knowledge. The question was why my removal was so important to his plans. I was hardly a major financial drain on the family resources. My consulting work actually generated modest income, and I had never been particularly extravagant in my spending. If anything, I had been careful to avoid giving Harold ammunition for criticism by living well below the means that Lax's wealth provided. I spent the morning researching divorce laws in Oregon, not because I had decided to leave Alex, but because I needed to understand what Harold might be planning. What I found made my blood run cold. Oregon was a community property state, which meant that Alex's assets acquired during our marriage would be subject to division if we divorced. More importantly, his shares in Blackwood Technologies, which had increased dramatically in value over the past 3 years, could potentially be affected by a divorce settlement. Harold wasn't just trying to drive me away to solve a personal problem. He was protecting the family assets from a potential divorce that could cost them tens of millions of dollars. My presence in the family had become a liability that threatened the very foundation of their wealth and power. The realization was both devastating and oddly empowering. I had spent 3 years believing that Harold's hostility was based on personal dislike or class prejudice. Learning that it was actually a calculated business decision somehow made it easier to bear. I wasn't being rejected as a person. I was being eliminated as a threat to an empire built on the systematic exploitation of relationships and resources. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives. A mother was loading groceries into a minivan while her toddler played with a toy truck. An elderly man was washing his sedan with the methodical care of someone who took pride in maintaining what he owned. A teenage girl was sitting on the hood of an old Honda, talking animatedly on her phone while gesturing with her free hand. These people probably worried about mortgage payments and medical bills and whether their children would get into good colleges. But they weren't living in a world where their personal relationships were treated as business transactions, where love was conditional on financial utility, where a father-in-law could attempt to destroy a marriage to protect his investment portfolio. I envied them their uncomplicated problem. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Alex's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time since leaving the family dinner I answered. "Zara, thank God," he said, his voice tight with stress. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Where are you?" "I told you I needed space to think," I replied, settling back on the bed. "How are you, Alex?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "How am I? I'm worried sick about my wife who disappeared without explanation. Dad's been asking questions, Mom's planning some charity thing that needs your input, and I have 3 board meetings this week that I can't focus on because I don't know if you're coming home." I noticed that his primary concerns were about the inconvenience my absence was causing rather than my emotional well-being or the reasons I had left in the first place. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm staying at the Riverside Motel on East Burnside, room 27, in case you were actually worried about my safety." There was a long pause. "The Riverside? Zara, that's not safe. Come home and we'll talk about whatever's bothering you." "What's bothering me," I said carefully, "is that your father called me worthless in front of your entire family, and you didn't say a single word in my defense. He was having a bad day, the Henderson deal fell through and he was taking it out on everyone. It wasn't personal. It was extremely personal, Alex, and it wasn't the first time. Your father has been systematically undermining me for months, and you've been letting it happen." Another pause, shorter this time. "Look, I know Dad can be difficult, but he's under a lot of pressure right now. The company's going through some challenges and he's not handling it well. If you could just be patient with him until things settle down." "How long?" I interrupted. "How long should I be patient while he treats me like an inconvenience? How long should I wait for you to decide that your wife deserves basic respect from your family? That's not fair, Zara. You knew what you were getting into when you married me. My family comes with expectations, with responsibilities. I can't just cut ties with Dad because he hurt your feelings." The casual dismissal in his voice, the way he reduced 3 years of systematic mistreatment to hurt feelings, crystallized everything I had been trying to understand about my place in the Blackwood family. "Your family comes with a lot of things, but apparently loyalty to your wife isn't one of them. Don't be dramatic. Come home and we'll figure this out. Mom's already planned a dinner party for Saturday and she needs your help with the arrangement. Tell your mother I'm busy." "Busy with what? You're staying in a motel, Zara." What could you possibly be doing that's more important than your marriage? The question revealed so much about how he saw me, how he understood my value and purpose. I existed to serve the family's needs, to fulfill social obligations, to be available whenever they required my presence. The idea that I might have independent interests or projects was so foreign to him that he couldn't even imagine what those might be. I'm reconnecting with my professional contacts, exploring new opportunities, remembering what it feels like to be valued for my expertise rather than tolerated as a necessary inconvenience. You don't need to work, Zara. I make enough money to support both of us comfortably. More than comfortably. It's not about money, Alex. It's about purpose, about contributing something meaningful to the world. It's about being seen as a whole person rather than an accessory to someone else's life. I could hear him typing in the background, probably responding to emails while we talked about the future of our marriage. The multitasking was so automatic that he probably didn't even realize he was doing it, but it perfectly illustrated the problem between us. I would always be secondary to Blackwood Technologies, tertiary to his father's demands, an afterthought to be managed when more important matters had been addressed. Look, he said, his voice taking on the tone he used for difficult negotiations. I understand you're upset. Maybe we should consider couples counseling or something. But right now, I need you to come home and help me deal with the situation with Dad. He's talking about bringing in Kane as a partner, and I need to present a united front to convince him that's a bad idea. The mention of Kane confirmed my research, but more importantly, it revealed Alex's true motivation for wanting me to return. He didn't want to repair our relationship or address the fundamental problems in our marriage. He wanted to use my presence as a prop in his business negotiations with his father. What does Vincent Kane have to do with me coming home? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dad respects family unity. If he sees that we're solid, that our marriage is stable, he'll be more likely to listen to my concerns about Kane. But if you're off having some kind of breakdown, it makes me look weak and unreliable. There it was, spoken with devastating clarity. My emotional well-being was less important than Alex's business credibility. My need for respect and support was secondary to his desire to maintain leverage in family politics. I was expected to swallow my hurt and return to play my role as the dutiful wife because my husband needed me to validate his authority in his father's eyes. I'm not having a breakdown, Alex, I said quietly. I'm having a breakthrough. And you're here to what exactly? Verify that Harold's promises are realistic? I'm here to offer you an alternative, Kane said, his voice taking on a smoother, more persuasive tone. Harold's approach to this situation has been unnecessarily adversarial. But there are other ways to achieve the same result that would be more beneficial for everyone involved, including you. I'm listening. A quiet divorce, amicably arranged, with a settlement that would make you financially independent for life. No public accusations, no media attention, no lengthy legal battles. You could return to your career with resources that would allow you to pursue any opportunities that interest you. Alex could focus on his business responsibilities without the distraction of family conflict. Everyone wins. Except that I haven't asked for a divorce, Mr. Kane. I'm having a disagreement with my husband's family, not ending my marriage. But you're not happy, Mrs. Blackwood. Anyone can see that. You're staying in a motel rather than in your own home, avoiding family obligations, pursuing independent projects that suggest you're already building a life separate from the Blackwoods. Why not make it official and benefit financially from the transition? The fact that he knew about my recent activities, my work with the local artists, my absence from family functions, meant that I was being watched and reported on. Harold's campaign against me was more extensive and invasive than I had realized. How much? I asked, not because I was interested in accepting, but because I needed to understand the scope of what they were planning. $5 million, Kane said without hesitation. Deposited in an account of your choosing within 72 hours of the divorce papers being filed, plus a commitment from my development company to provide funding for whatever art-related projects you want to pursue. You could establish your own gallery, support emerging artists, make a real difference in the cultural landscape. Think of what you could accomplish with those resources. It was a breathtaking offer, the kind of financial security that would allow me to pursue my passions without any concern for commercial viability. I could support dozens of artists, establish programs that would provide opportunities for people who had been excluded from traditional art world networks, create the kind of cultural institution that I had always dreamed of building. But the source of the money made it impossible to consider seriously. Kane wasn't offering me independence. He was offering me a different kind of dependency, one that would make me complicit in whatever schemes he and Harold were planning. That's very generous, Mr. Kane, I said. But I'm not interested in being bought out of my own marriage. Think about it, Mrs. Blackwood. Don't let pride prevent you from making a decision that could benefit everyone involved. Harold is determined to resolve this situation one way or another. It would be much better for you if that resolution happened on terms that you had helped to negotiate. The threat was barely concealed. If I didn't accept Kane's offer, Harold would find other ways to destroy my marriage and drive me away from the family. But those methods might be less generous, less respectful of my dignity and financial security. I'll consider your proposal, I lied, wanting to end the conversation before it escalated into something more explicitly threatening. Excellent. I'll give you 48 hours to make a decision. After that, I'm afraid the offer will no longer be available, and Harold will need to pursue other options. He handed me a business card through the gap in the door, his fingers brushing mine briefly in a contact that felt deliberately intimate and deeply unpleasant. Good night, Mrs. Blackwood. I look forward to hearing from you soon. I watched through the peephole as he walked across the parking lot to a black Mercedes that had been idling near the motel office. Only after the car had disappeared into the night traffic did I close the door and engage all the law. I sat on the edge of the bed, Kane's business card heavy in my hand like a piece of evidence in a crime I hadn't yet understood I was witnessing. $5 million to walk away from my marriage, to cooperate in whatever corrupt business deal Harold and Kane were planning, to disappear quietly while they restructured the Blackwood empire without the inconvenience of community property laws and family loyalty. The offer revealed the true scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about Harold's personal dislike or his financial problem. I had stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that involved corporate partnerships, real estate manipulation, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might interfere with their plans. I was no longer just a daughter-in-law being mistreated by difficult in-laws. I was a witness to criminal activity, a potential obstacle to a business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a problem that needed to be solved before it became a liability. And Alex, whether he realized it or not, was being positioned as either a collaborator or another victim in his father's schemes. I needed help, professional help from someone who understood the legal and financial implications of what I had discovered. But first I needed to document everything I knew and secure the evidence in case something happened to me before I could expose what Harold and Kane were planning. I opened my laptop and began to write, detailing every conversation, every threat, every suspicious coincidence that had led me to this moment. I uploaded copies of my research to a secure cloud storage account and emailed encrypted files to myself at multiple addresses. If Harold thought he could make me disappear without consequences, he was about to learn that some problems only get bigger when you try to eliminate them. By 3 a.m, I had created a comprehensive record of everything I had discovered about the Blackwood family's financial problems and Kane's involvement in their attempted solutions. I had also made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to fight back, not just for my marriage or my place in the family, but for the principle that people shouldn't be treated as expendable assets in other people's business plans. Harold and Kane had made the mistake of assuming that I would be easy to intimidate, quick to accept their bribes, willing to disappear quietly when it became convenient for them. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The morning after Kane's visit brought an unexpected out. Nadia arrived at the coffee shop precisely at 10, her familiar wild curls barely contained by a colorful silk scarf, her vintage leather jacket adorned with pins from art exhibitions spanning the past decade. She looked exactly like the fearless curator I remembered, the woman who had once convinced a notoriously difficult collector to donate his entire contemporary sculpture collection to public institutions. "You look different," she said, settling into the chair across from me with 2 steaming cups between us. "Shopper somehow, like you've been living underwater for years and finally came up for air." I laughed, surprised by how accurate her assessment felt. "It's been an interesting week. I heard you were at the museum on Tuesday. Zara mentioned seeing you in the contemporary wing. Said you spent an hour with the Martinez piece." Nadia's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "That's the artist you championed back in the day, right? Before you became a society-wide." The casual reference to my transformation stung, but not in the way it would have a week ago. Now it felt like an acknowledgement of something I was actively working to change, rather than a permanent verdict on who I had become. "I've been doing a lot of remembering lately," I said, "about who I was before I started trying to be who other people wanted me to be." Nadia leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Zara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, it won't change what I'm about to propose. But are you planning to stay married to Alex?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "A lot depends on whether the man I married still exists under all the family pressure and business obligations." "Fair enough." But here's the thing, whether you stay married or not, you need to reclaim your professional identity. The art world has changed a lot in the past 3 years, but your reputation is still solid. People remember your eye, your integrity, your ability to spot talent before anyone else recognizes it. She pulled a tablet from her oversized tote bag and slid it across the table. This is what I wanted to show you. There's a new initiative starting up, privately funded, designed to support emerging artists who've been overlooked by traditional gallery systems. Think of it as a combination incubator, exhibition space and sales platform, but with a focus on artists from underrepresented communities. I scrolled through the presentation, my excitement building with each slide. The concept was ambitious but thoughtful, addressing real gaps in the current art ecosystem, while maintaining high standards for quality and artistic vision. This is incredible, Nadia. Who's funding it? A consortium of collectors who are tired of seeing the same recycled names in every major exhibition. They want to invest in discovery, in giving platforms to voices that haven't been heard yet. And they need someone to run it, someone with credibility and vision, and the kind of network that can make things happen. I looked up from the tablet, my heart racing. Are you offering me the job? I'm offering you the opportunity to interview for. The salary is competitive, the creative freedom is unprecedented, and the potential impact is enormous. But Zara, it would mean committing fully to your professional life again. No more playing second fiddle to family social obligations or husband's business dinner. This would be your career, your reputation, your legacy. The weight of the opportunities settled over me like a blanket, warm and substantial and completely different from the suffocating expectations I had grown accustomed to in the Blackwood household. This was work that mattered, work that utilized my skills and knowledge in service of something larger than myself. When would you need an answer? I asked. The interview is scheduled for next Friday. If you're interested, I can set it up. But Zara, you should know that taking this position would make you very visible in the art world again. You'd be attending openings, giving interviews, representing the organization at conferences and panels. It's not a behind-the-scenes role. I thought about Harold's systematic campaign to diminish my visibility, his efforts to erase me from family photos and social media posts, his determination to make me disappear entirely from any narrative that mattered. The idea of stepping boldly back into public professional life felt like the most powerful form of resistance I could imagine. Set up the interview, I said without hesitation. I'm interested. Nadia grinned, the first genuinely joyful expression I had seen from her since she arrived. I was hoping you'd say that. There's something else though. The position would be based here in Portland, but it would require some travel. New York, Los Angeles, maybe international locations depending on the artists we're working with. Would that be a problem? I considered the question carefully. A week ago, the idea of committing to travel without consulting Alex first would have been unthinkable. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. No problem at all, I'm ready to get back to work. We spent the next hour discussing the details of the position, the vision behind the organization, and the kind of artists they hoped to support. By the time Nadia left, I felt more energized and purposeful than I had in years. I also felt something I hadn't experienced since my wedding day, genuine excitement about the future. I walked back to the motel with a spring in my step that hadn't been there in months. The October air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of rain. Portland had always been a city that embraced reinvention, welcoming people who wanted to start over, to become something new and authentic. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I belonged to the city rather than just visiting it as Alex's wife. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Marcus Webb, Mr. Alexander's assistant. He's asked me to inform you that your presence is required at Blackwood Technologies this afternoon at 3 p.m. for an urgent family meeting. Please confirm your attendance. The formal tone and the presumption that I would simply comply with the summons made my newfound confidence flare into something harder and more defiant. I typed back, please inform Mr. Alexander that I'm unavailable this afternoon. If he'd like to schedule a conversation, he can call me directly. The response came within minutes. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Harold specifically requested your attendance. This is regarding time-sensitive business matters that affect the entire family. I turned off my phone without responding. If Harold wanted to speak with me, he could do it without the elaborate power plays and intimidation tactics. I was done being summoned like an employee or treated like a problem to be managed. Instead, I spent the afternoon visiting the first artist studio on my list, a converted warehouse space in southeast Portland, where a young painter named David Chen was creating large-scale urban landscapes that captured the soul of the city with remarkable sensitivity. His work had the kind of authentic voice that galleries like the one Nadia had described were designed to support. David was shy at first, uncertain why an art consultant would be interested in his work when he had never shown in a formal gallery setting. But as we talked about his process, his inspiration, his dreams for his career, his passion became evident. He was creating art because he had something important to say about place and belonging, about finding beauty in overlooked corners of the urban environment. "I've never had anyone talk to me about my work like this," he said as we examined his latest series. "Like it actually matters, like it might mean something to people I've never met." "Art always matters," I replied, remembering why I had fallen in love with this work in the first place. "The question is finding the right people to help it reach the audience it deserves." I left his studio with photographs of 12 paintings, and a commitment to include him in the viewing party I was organizing for the following week. More importantly, I left with a renewed sense of purpose that had nothing to do with family obligations or social expectations, and everything to do with the transformative power of authentic creative expression. My phone showed 17 missed calls when I turned it back on during the drive back to the motel. Most were from Alex, but there were also several from numbers I didn't recognize and one from Constance, that had been left as a voicemail. I listened to her message while sitting in the motel parking lot. "Zara, dear," her carefully modulated voice carried an edge of steel beneath the surface politeness. "I'm calling because you missed this afternoon's family meeting, and frankly, I'm concerned about your judgment. Harold has some very serious matters to discuss with you, matters that affect all of our futures. I hope you'll reconsider whatever misguided stance you're taking and return to the family where you belong. We can work through these difficulties, but only if you're willing to be reasonable." The message revealed more than Constance probably intended. The family meeting hadn't been about reconciliation or addressing my concerns about Harold's treatment. It had been about presenting me with ultimatums, about forcing me to choose between capitulation and consequences they assumed I wouldn't be willing to face. I called Alex directly, knowing that avoiding the conversation would only escalate their attempts to control the situation. He answered on the first ring. "Zara, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you all day." "I was working," I said. "Studio visits, meetings with potential clients. You know, the kind of activities you said I didn't need to pursue since you make enough money to support us both." This isn't the time for sarcasm. "Dad's furious that you didn't show up today. He had important information to share with you, information that affects your future with this family." "What kind of information?" Alex paused and I could hear him walking, probably pacing in his office while trying to find the right words to manipulate me into compliance. "There are some business decisions that need to be made, partnerships that could benefit everyone. But they require certain assurances about family stability, about everyone being on the same page moving forward." "You mean the Kane partnership?" I said, enjoying the sharp intake of breath that greeted this revelation. "Yes, Alex. I know about Vincent Kane. I know about your father's financial problems, and I know about the offer I received last night." "What offer?" His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled. "Kane visited me at the motel. He offered me $5 million to divorce you quietly and disappear from the family equation. Apparently my marriage to you creates complications for their business arrangement." The silence stretched so long that I thought the call might have been dropped. When Alex finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "You're lying." "I'm not lying, Alex. Kane found me at the motel, knew details about my activities that could only have come from family surveillance, and made me an offer that was clearly coordinated with your father. The question is whether you knew about it or whether you're as much a victim in this situation as I am." "Dad wouldn't. Kane couldn't have." He trailed off, and I could practically hear him trying to reconcile his image of his father with the evidence of Harold's betrayal. "Your father has been systematically trying to destroy our marriage for months, Alex. Every cruel comment, every public humiliation, every attempt to make me feel worthless, has been part of a calculated campaign to drive me away before his business problems became public knowledge. And you've been letting it happen because you were more concerned about maintaining family harmony than protecting your wife." "That's not true. Dad's been under stress, but he wouldn't deliberately sabotage our marriage." "Then explain Kane's visit." "Explain how he knew where to find me, how he knew about my recent activities, how he was authorized to offer me millions of dollars to disappear. Explain how any of that happens without your father's knowledge and approval." Another long silence. When Alex spoke again, his voice was different, smaller somehow. "I need to talk to Dad." "Yes, you do. And when you're done with that conversation, you need to decide whether you're going to stand up for your wife or continue being complicit in your father's schemes." "Zara, wait. Don't hang up. Where are you staying? I'll come to you and we can figure this out together." I almost told him. For a moment the familiar pattern of our relationship reasserted itself, and I wanted to believe that he would finally choose me over his family's demand. But then I remembered Kane's predatory smile, Harold's calculated cruelty, the years of systematic diminishment that had brought me to this point. No, Alex, I'm done being managed and manipulated by your family. If you want to save our marriage, you need to prove that you're willing to stand up to your father without using me as a prop or a negotiating tool. Until then, I'll be making my own decisions about my future. I hung up before he could respond and immediately turned off my phone again. I needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to use the information I had gathered to protect myself and expose the conspiracy that was attempting to destroy my life. I spent the evening researching Vincent Kane's business practices more thoroughly, diving deep into public records and news articles that painted a disturbing picture of corruption and regulatory violation. Kane's development company had been investigated multiple times for environmental violations, labor violations, and fraudulent financial reporting. No charges had ever been filed, but the pattern of accusations suggested a systematic disregard for legal and ethical constraint. The most troubling discovery was a series of partnerships Kane had formed with other financially distressed real estate companies. In each case, the partnerships had resulted in massive profits for Kane's organization, while the original companies had either gone bankrupt or been absorbed into Kane's empire under suspicious circumstances.
Harold wasn't just making a deal with a questionable partner. He was potentially walking into a trap that would cost the Blackwood family everything they had built over generations. Kane's offer to buy me out of the marriage wasn't just about removing a legal complication. It was about isolating Harold from anyone who might warn him about the true nature of the arrangement he was entering. I realized that I might be the only person in a position to save the Blackwood empire from Kane's predatory schemes. The irony was breathtaking. Harold had spent months trying to drive me away to protect his business interests, when in reality my knowledge and research skills might be the only thing standing between his family and financial ruin. But saving Harold would require revealing what I had discovered, which would mean admitting that I had been investigating the family's private business affairs. It would also mean providing assistance to the man who had systematically abused and humiliated me, who had attempted to have me bribed into disappearing from his son's life. I sat in the motel room until nearly midnight, weighing my options and their potential consequences. I could expose Kane's history and save Harold's business, potentially preserving the family wealth that supported Alex's lifestyle and career. I could accept Kane's offer and disappear with enough money to fund my own artistic endeavors for life. I could simply walk away and let the Blackwoods face the consequences of their choices without my intervention. Or I could find a fourth option, one that protected my interests while ensuring that justice was served to everyone who had wronged me. By the time I finally fell asleep, I had made my decision. It was bold and risky and completely unlike anything the old Zara would have considered. But the woman I was becoming was capable of strategic thinking that the Blackwood family had never imagined, and it was time to show them exactly what kind of adversary they had created through their systematic attempts to diminish and control me. The next morning brought another unexpected visitor. I was drinking coffee and reviewing my notes when someone knocked softly on the motel room door. This time, when I looked through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged with graying hair and a kind face, holding what appeared to be an envelope. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Catherine Morris. I'm an investigative journalist with the Portland Tribune. I was hoping we could talk." My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my voice calm. "About what?" "About Vincent Kane, Harold Blackwood, and a real estate development scheme that could defraud investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars." The scope of what I was dealing with suddenly became much larger and more dangerous. Kane and Harold weren't just planning a private business partnership. They were apparently involved in something that had attracted the attention of investigative reporters, which meant federal agencies and regulatory bodies might also be watching their activities. "I'm not sure I can help you with that," I said carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I know this is frightening, but I also know that you've been gathering information about the Blackwood family's financial situation and Kane's involvement in their business plan. That research could be invaluable in exposing a scheme that will hurt a lot of innocent people if it's allowed to proceed." The fact that she knew about my research meant that I was being watched by more parties than I had realized. The stakes of this situation were escalating beyond anything I had imagined when I first walked out of Harold's dining room. "How do you know about my research?" I asked. "I have sources who are concerned about your safety, Mrs. Blackwood. Kane has a history of eliminating problems through intimidation and worse. Your refusal to accept his offer last night put you in a very dangerous position." The words hit me like ice water. I had been thinking about this situation in terms of family dynamics and business competition,
but Catherine's warning suggested that I was dealing with actual criminals who might resort to violence to protect their interests. What exactly do you think I know? I asked, still speaking through the partially open door. I think you know that Harold Blackwood is about to sign contracts that will give Kane control of properties worth over $200 million. I think you know that those contracts contain clauses that will allow Kane to seize the entire Blackwood real estate portfolio if Harold defaults on loans that Kane himself will control. And I think you know that your marriage to Alex creates legal complications that could prevent Kane from executing his takeover plan. She was right about all of it, and the fact that she had reached the same conclusions I had through independent investigation confirmed that my analysis was accurate. But her knowledge also meant that the conspiracy was much broader than I had understood, involving multiple parties and regulatory violations that could result in federal criminal charges. If you already know all of this, why do you need me? I asked. Because I need documentary evidence, and I need someone with credibility to go on the record about Kane's attempts to eliminate obstacles to his scheme. Your testimony about his bribery attempt, combined with the financial documents you've gathered, could provide the foundation for a criminal investigation that would shut down this operation before anyone gets hurt. I looked at Catherine Morrison's earnest face and realized that I was being offered a choice between remaining a victim of other people's schemes or becoming an active participant in bringing those schemes to justice. The old Zara would have been terrified by the implications, would have looked for ways to extract herself from the situation without making waves or attracting attention. But the woman I was becoming understood that sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to fight back with everything you have, using every resource at your disposal to ensure that the people who have wronged you face consequences for their actions. I'll give you 1 hour, I said, opening the door fully for the first time. But I want to see your credentials, and I want assurances about how my information will be used and what kind of protection will be available if Kane decides to retaliate. Catherine Morrison smiled as she stepped into my motel room, and I realized that I had just committed to a course of action that would change everything about my relationship with the Blackwood family. There would be no going back to the quiet, manageable life of a society wife who caused no trouble and attracted no attention. I was about to become the kind of problem that Harold Blackwood had never imagined he might have to solve. And Vincent Kane was going to discover that the woman he had tried to buy off was actually the key to his own destruction. The next hour would determine whether I had the courage to follow through on the most important decision of my adult life, or whether I would retreat back into the safety of silence and compliance that had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth. As Catherine settled into the single chair beside the small table and opened her recorder, I realized that I had never felt more terrified or more alive than I did at that moment. The woman Harold had called worthless was about to prove exactly how much damage she could cause when she finally decided to fight back. Catherine Morrison spread her documents across the small motel table with the precision of someone accustomed to working in cramped spaces. Her press credentials were legitimate, her recording equipment professional, and her knowledge of the Kane Blackwood situation disturbingly comprehensive. As she organized her materials, I realized that I was no longer dealing with a family dispute that had spiraled out of control. I was sitting in the middle of a federal investigation that had been building for months. Before we begin, Catherine said, adjusting her recorder, I need you to understand the scope of what we're discussing. Vincent Kane isn't just a problematic business partner. He's the subject of an ongoing FBI investigation into real estate fraud, money laundering and racketeering. His partnership with your father-in-law isn't a legitimate business arrangement. It's the final phase of a systematic takeover that will leave the Blackwood family with nothing while enriching Kane and his associates by hundreds of millions of dollars. The weight of her words settled over me like a physical force. Harold's financial problems weren't just about overextension and poor judgment. He was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed by professional criminals who specialized in destroying exactly the kind of family empire the Blackwoods had spent generations building. How long have you been investigating this? I asked. 8 months. Kane's organization came to our attention through a tip from a former employee who witnessed document forgery and witnessed intimidation of potential witnesses. Since then, we've uncovered a pattern of similar schemes in Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver. Always the same method. Target financially vulnerable real estate companies, offer partnerships that seem too good to refuse, then use contractual loopholes and manufactured defaults to seize everything. She pulled out a thick folder filled with financial documents and photographs. The Blackwood Properties deal is different, though. It's the biggest target Kane has ever attempted, and the potential payoff is enormous. Your father-in-law controls assets worth over $300 million, all of which will transfer to Kane's control once the partnership contracts are signed. I stared at the documents, recognizing some of the property names from conversations I had overheard at family dinner. Harold owned commercial buildings throughout the Pacific Northwest, residential developments in 3 states,
and undeveloped land parcels that had been appreciating in value for decades. The idea that all of this could be lost to a criminal conspiracy was staggering. "Why hasn't anyone warned Harold about this?" I asked. "Surely his lawyers would recognize the risks in these contracts." Catherine's expression darkened. "Kane is very good at what he does. The contracts appear legitimate on the surface, drafted by respected law firms and reviewed by financial advisors who have been either compromised or deceived. The poison pills are buried deep in subsidiary clauses and technical language that even experienced attorneys might miss. By the time Harold realizes what he's signed, it will be too late to reverse the transfers." She showed me copies of similar contracts from Kane's previous operations, pointing out the seemingly innocuous language that had later been used to justify asset seizure. The legal architecture was sophisticated and ruthless, designed to withstand challenges while providing Kane with multiple pathways to claim breach of contract. "There's something else," Catherine continued, pulling out a separate file. "Kane's attempt to bribe you wasn't just about removing a potential legal complication. You represent something much more dangerous to his operation, an intelligent witness with access to inside information, who isn't dependent on the Blackwood family for financial support. Your research into Harold's finances and your documentation of the family dynamics make you a critical threat to their timeline." The implications hit me with startling clarity. Kane hadn't offered me $5 million just to clear a legal hurdle. He had been attempting to buy my silence about crimes that could send him to federal prison for decades. My refusal to accept his offer had transformed me from a manageable problem into an active threat to an operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "What happens next?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "That depends on you," Catherine replied. "I can continue my investigation using the information I've already gathered, but without insider testimony and documentation, it could take months to build a case strong enough to stop Kane before he executes his plan. Your cooperation could accelerate that timeline significantly." She leaned forward, her eyes intense with the urgency of someone who had spent months watching a disaster approach in slow motion. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand something. Kane has eliminated obstacles before. Witnesses have been intimidated into silence. Potential whistleblowers have had their careers destroyed, and there have been accidents involving people who posed serious threats to his operation. Your safety depends on your ability to help us build a case quickly enough to put Kane behind bars before he decides you're too dangerous to leave free." The threat was explicit and terrifying, but it also crystallized something that had been building in my mind since Kane's visit. I could continue hiding in motel rooms and coffee shops, hoping that the criminals would lose interest and move on to easier targets. Or I could use everything I had learned and discovered to fight back with the full weight of federal law enforcement behind me. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Catherine pulled out a legal pad and uncapped her pen. "Everything. Every conversation you've had with Harold about his financial situation, every detail of Kane's visit, every document you've seen or heard reference. I also need you to consider the possibility of wearing a recording device if Kane or Harold contact you again." I spent the next 3 hours providing Catherine with a comprehensive account of everything I had witnessed and discovered over the past week. She recorded our conversation while taking detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional context. When I mentioned the encrypted files I had created containing my research, her eyes lit up with professional excitement. "Can you provide me with copies of those files?" she asked. "I can do better than that," I replied, opening my laptop. "I can show you the original sources and explain how I reached my conclusions." We spent another hour reviewing my financial analysis of Harold's situation and my documentation of the family's attempts to drive me away. Catherine was particularly interested in the timeline correlations I had identified, the way Harold's hostility had escalated in direct proportion to his financial desperation. "This is excellent work," she said when we finished. "You've identified connections and patterns that confirm what we suspected but couldn't prove. Your documentation of Harold's systematic campaign against you provides crucial context for understanding Kane's motivations and methods." As afternoon faded into evening, Catherine packed up her materials with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had hoped to achieve. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you one more question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Are you prepared to testify about all of this in federal court if necessary?" The question forced me to confront the ultimate implications of the choice I was making. Testifying against Kane would mean facing cross-examination by defense attorneys who would attempt to discredit my testimony by attacking my character, my motivations, and my relationship with the Blackwood family. It would mean enduring public scrutiny and media attention on a scale I had never experienced. It would also mean permanently severing any possibility of reconciliation with Harold and potentially with Alex if he chose to side with his father. But it would also mean ensuring that Kane faced consequences for his crimes and that other families wouldn't suffer the same fate that Harold was walking toward unknowingly. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm prepared to testify. Catherine smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I had seen from her all day. I hoped you'd say that. Mrs. Blackwood, what you're doing requires tremendous courage. You're risking your safety and your family relationships to protect people who have treated you terribly and to serve a larger justice that may never directly benefit you. That's the definition of heroism. After Catherine left, I sat alone in the motel room feeling simultaneously empowered and terrified. I had committed to a course of action that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life, but I had done so with full knowledge of the risks and potential consequences. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making decisions based on my own moral compass, rather than other people's expectations. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout my conversation with Catherine, but I had ignored it to focus on our discussion. Now I checked the messages and found a series increasingly frantic communications from Alex, Harold, and even Constance. The most recent message was from Alex. Zara, Dad's meeting with Kane tomorrow morning to sign preliminary agreements. Please call me. This is urgent. The timeline Catherine had warned me about was accelerating. Kane was moving quickly to finalize his takeover before anyone could interfere with his plan. I realized that Harold might sign documents as early as tomorrow that would begin the process of transferring Blackwood assets into Kane's control. I called Alex immediately, knowing that this conversation would determine whether my husband was a victim of his father's poor judgment or a willing participant in Kane's scheme. Zara, thank God, he said, answering on the first ring. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day. I've been busy, I said. Alex, you cannot let your father sign any agreements with Vincent Kane tomorrow. I'm serious. It's a trap that will cost your family everything. What are you talking about? Kane's offering us a partnership that could solve all of Dad's financial problems. The terms are incredibly generous. The terms are designed to look generous, while giving Kane legal control over your family's assets. Alex, Kane isn't a legitimate businessman. He's a criminal who specializes in defrauding real estate companies exactly like Blackwood Property. There was a long pause. When Alex spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. Zara, I think you need to be very careful about making accusations like that. Kane's lawyers have reviewed all the documentation, and everything is completely legitimate. Kane's lawyers work for Kane, Alex. They're not protecting your father's interests. They're helping Kane design a takeover that will look legal until it's too late to reverse it. You're being paranoid. Dad's not stupid, and his legal team isn't incompetent. They wouldn't let him sign anything that wasn't in his best interest. The absolute certainty in Alex's voice told me that he either genuinely didn't understand the sophistication of Kane's operation, or he was deliberately choosing to ignore evidence that contradicted his preferred narrative. Either way, he wasn't willing to consider the possibility that his father was making a catastrophic mistake. Alex, Kane visited me 2 nights ago and offered me $5 million to divorce you and disappear from the family. Does that sound like the behavior of a legitimate business partner? Another pause, longer this time. Kane mentioned that conversation to Dad. He said you misunderstood his intentions, that he was simply trying to address your obvious unhappiness with the family situation. The ease with which Alex accepted Kane's version of events over his wife's first-hand account was devastating but not surprising. Throughout our marriage, Alex had consistently chosen the interpretation of events that caused him the least discomfort, even when that meant dismissing my concerns or minimizing my experiences. Alex, I'm begging you to listen to me. Have your father's lawyers conduct independent research into Kane's business history. Look at what happened to his previous partners. Check with the Better Business Bureau, with state regulatory agencies, with anyone who isn't connected to Kane's organization. If I'm wrong, you'll have lost nothing but a few hours of research time. If I'm right, you'll have saved your family from financial ruin. Zara, I understand you're upset about the situation with Dad, but you can't let personal feelings cloud your judgment about business matters. Kane comes highly recommended by people we trust. The partnership is going to benefit everyone involved. The patronizing tone in his voice, the casual dismissal of my concerns as emotional rather than rational, crystallized everything that was wrong with our relationship. Alex had never seen me as an intellectual equal capable of sound judgment. I was the artistic wife whose opinions were charming but irrelevant when serious matters were at stake. Fine, I said, my voice going flat and cold. Don't listen to me. Sign the contracts, transfer the assets, trust the criminals. But Alex, when your family loses everything and you're left wondering how it happened, remember this conversation. Remember that your wife tried to warn you and you chose to ignore her because you didn't think she was smart enough to understand business. Zara, wait, I hung up before he could finish his sentence and immediately turned off my phone. There was no point in continuing a conversation with someone who had already decided that my concerns were invalid. Alex had made his choice, and it wasn't me. I sat in the darkness of the motel room, processing the implications of what had just happened. My marriage was effectively over, not because of Harold's cruelty or Kane's threats, but because of Alex's fundamental inability to see me as anything more than a decorative accessory to his life. He would rather trust criminals than listen to his wife's warnings, rather risk his family's fortune than admit that I might possess insights he lacked. The next morning brought a knock on my door at exactly 7 o'clock. I looked through the peephole expecting to see Catherine Morrison, or perhaps another of Kane's associates, but instead I found Mrs. Delacroix, the Blackwood family's housekeeper, holding a small envelope and looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Delacroix," I said, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" "Mrs. Zara," she said in her soft voice with its faint French accent, "I am sorry to disturb you, but I have something very important to give you. Something Mr. Harold does not know I—" She handed me the envelope, which was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. "This came to the house 3 days ago, but Mr. Harold told me to throw it away without giving it to you. I kept it instead because I thought you should decide for yourself whether it was important." I opened the envelope and pulled out a letter written on law firm letterhead. As I read, my heart began to race. The letter was from a Seattle attorney representing a group of investors who had been defrauded by Vincent Kane in a previous real estate scheme. They had somehow learned about Kane's current involvement with Blackwood Properties, and were offering to provide information that could help the family avoid the same fate they had suffered. "Miss Delacroix," I said, looking up from the letter, "how many other pieces of mail has Harold prevented me from receiving?" Her expression was pained but determined.
"Several, Mrs. Zara. Letters from lawyers, from business people who said they had important information for the family. Mr. Harold said they were all from troublemakers trying to interfere with legitimate business arrangements." The systematic interception of my mail revealed another layer of Harold's campaign to isolate me from information that might threaten his plans. He hadn't just been trying to drive me away from the family. He had been actively preventing me from receiving warnings that could have exposed Kane's true nature weeks ago. "Is there anything else I should know, Mrs. Delacroix?" She hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. "I have been recording conversations in the house, Mrs. Zara. Not to spy, but to protect myself in case Mr. Harold tried to blame me for things that went wrong. Last night I recorded a conversation between Mr. Harold and Mr. Kane that I think you should hear." She handed me the device and showed me how to operate it. The recording was crystal clear, capturing a conversation that had taken place in Harold's study while the rest of the family was presumably asleep. Kane's voice was instantly recognizable. "The preliminary agreements are ready for signature tomorrow morning. Once those are executed, we'll have legal standing to begin the asset transfer process." Harold's response was weary but determined. "And you're certain this will solve our financial problems? The loans you're arranging will cover all our outstanding obligations?" "Absolutely," Kane replied. "Within 90 days, Blackwood Properties will be debt-free and positioned for unprecedented growth. All you need to do is trust the process and ignore any interference from family members who don't understand the complexities of the arrangement." "Zara's been asking questions, making trouble. Alex says she's been spreading rumors about your background." "Zara is exactly the kind of problem I specialize in solving," Kane said, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. "Don't worry about your daughter-in-law, Harold. After tomorrow, she won't be in a position to cause any more difficulties for the family." The recording continued for several more minutes, but I had heard enough. Kane wasn't just planning to defraud the Blackwood family. He was planning to eliminate me as a threat to his operation, and Harold was apparently willing to let that happen in service of his business arrangement. I looked at Mrs. Delacroix, who was watching my face with obvious concern. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you have always been kind to me, Mrs. Zara. Because you are the only person in that house who sees me as a human being instead of furniture. And because what they are planning is wrong. Mr. Kane is a bad man, and Mr. Harold is too desperate to see it." I hugged her impulsively. This woman who had risked her job and potentially her safety to bring me information that could save my life. "Mrs. Delacroix, you need to stay away from the house for the next few days. What you've given me is going to cause a lot of trouble for Harold and Kane, and they might try to blame you for interfering with their plans." "Where should I go?" I gave her the contact information for Catherine Morrison and enough cash for a week in a decent hotel. "Call this reporter and tell her everything you've told me. She'll make sure you're protected while this situation gets resolved." After Mrs. Delacroix left, I immediately called Catherine and arranged to meet her within the hour. The recording device contained evidence of conspiracy, of threats against my safety, and of Harold's willingness to sacrifice his daughter-in-law to protect his business arrangement with criminal. As I prepared to leave the motel room that had served as my sanctuary for the past week, I realized that I was no longer just a victim seeking justice or a wife trying to save her marriage. I had become a key witness in a federal investigation, an active participant in bringing down a criminal organization, and a woman who had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The Blackwood family had tried to erase me, to make me disappear from their narrative and their future. Instead, their attempts to silence me had transformed me into the most dangerous threat they could have imagined, someone who knew their secrets, understood their weaknesses, and was no longer afraid to fight back with everything she had learned. Harold had called me worthless, but I was about to prove exactly how much a worthless woman could accomplish when she decided to stop accepting other people's definitions of her value. Kane had tried to buy my silence, but he was about to discover that some things could never be purchased, no matter how much money was offered. And Alex, who had chosen his father's judgment over his wife's warnings, was about to learn that the woman he had underestimated for 3 years was capable of actions that would change his family's destiny forever. The meeting with Catherine would set in motion events that none of them could control or contain. By the end of the day, the FBI would have enough evidence to arrest Vincent Kane and seize his assets. The Blackwood family would be saved from financial ruin, but the cost of that salvation would be the exposure of Harold's willingness to sacrifice his daughter-in-law and his son's marriage to protect his business interests. As I walked out of the Riverside Motel for the last time, carrying with me the evidence that would bring down a criminal conspiracy and destroy the family that had tried to destroy me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The woman Harold had dismissed as worthless was about to become the most important person in the room where decisions about his future would be made. And this time, I would be the one with the power to determine who deserved to be heard and who deserved to be ignored. Catherine Morrison's eyes lit up when she heard Mrs. Delacroix's recording. We were sitting in a secure conference room at the FBI field office downtown, surrounded by agents who had been building their case against Kane for months. The recording device sat in the center of the table like a small bomb that had already exploded, its contents now spreading through the room with devastating effect. "This is exactly what we needed," said Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on Kane's case. "Direct evidence of conspiracy, threats against a witness, and confirmation of the timeline we suspected. Mrs. Blackwood, this recording, combined with your testimony and documentation, gives us everything we need to move forward immediately." The room buzzed with controlled energy as agents began coordinating arrest warrants, asset seizures, and protective custody arrangements. I sat in the middle of it all, still processing the surreal transition from motel room refugee to federal witness in a matter of hours. "What happens now?" I asked Agent Chen. "We execute simultaneous arrests of Kane and his primary associates within the next 6 hours. We'll also be freezing all assets connected to his organization and obtaining injunctions to prevent any further transfers of Blackwood Properties assets. Your father-in-law's meeting with Kane this morning will be the last conversation they have as free men." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to be clear about what you can expect moving forward. Kane's organization has resources and connections that extend beyond what we've uncovered so far. Even with him in custody, there may be associates who view you as a threat to their operations. We're prepared to offer you protective custody until all related arrests have been made." The offer of protection was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant that the danger I faced was real and immediate, but it also meant that the federal government was committed to keeping me safe while justice ran its course. "For how long?" I asked. "Probably no more than a week or 2. Kane's network is extensive but not deeply rooted. Once we round up the key players, the immediate threat to your safety should be substantially reduced." As agents continued their preparations around us, Catherine pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Zara, there's something else you need to know. The story I'm going to publish will make you a public figure, at least temporarily. People are going to want to know about the woman who brought down Vincent Kane, who saved her family from financial ruin, despite their treatment of her. Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" I considered the question carefully. A week ago, the idea of being the subject of media scrutiny would have terrified me. But the woman I had become through this experience was no longer afraid of being seen, no longer concerned about other people's opinions of her choices and actions. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared for whatever comes next." The FBI operations began at exactly. I watched from the secure conference room as live feeds from multiple arrest locations played on wall-mounted monitor. Kane was taken into custody at his downtown office, his shocked expression suggesting that he had never considered the possibility that his carefully constructed schemes might unravel so quickly and completely.
Harold's arrest was more complicated. When agents arrived at Blackwood Technologies to prevent him from signing any agreements with Kane, they found him in his office with legal documents spread across his desk, a pen in his hand, apparently moments away from executing the contracts that would have sealed his family's fate. "Miss Blackwood," Agent Chen said through the conference room speaker as we watched the live feed, "I need you to step away from those documents immediately. Vincent Kane has been arrested on federal fraud charges, and we have evidence that the contracts you're about to sign are part of a criminal conspiracy to defraud your family of its assets." Harold's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a terrible understanding as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. He looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting his humiliation to the FBI conference room where his despised daughter-in-law sat watching his empire crumble around him. "Where is Zara?" he asked, his voice barely audible through the audio feed. "Miss Blackwood is in protective custody," Agent Chen replied. "She's the primary witness whose cooperation made these arrests possible." The look that crossed Harold's face was indescribable, a mixture of rage, betrayal, and something that might have been He had spent months trying to drive me away from his family, never imagining that his systematic cruelty would transform me into the instrument of his salvation and his destruction. Alex arrived at his father's office within minutes of the FBI raid, his face pale with shock as he surveyed the chaos of overturned furniture and scattered legal documents. I watched him through the security feed, this man I had loved and married, as he tried to comprehend the scope of what had happened to his family in a single morning. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice carrying clearly through the microphones that agents had left active. "Your wife," Harold said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Your wife just saved us from losing everything, and she did it by destroying everything else we thought we knew about our lives." The truth of that statement hit me with unexpected force. I had indeed saved the Blackwood family from financial ruin, but the cost of that salvation had been the exposure of lies and corruptions that went to the very heart of who they thought they were. Harold would never again be able to claim moral authority over business decisions. Alex would never again be able to dismiss his wife's intelligence or judgment. The family's reputation for ethical business practices had been permanently tainted by Harold's willingness to partner with criminals. Agent Chen turned to me as the arrest feeds concluded. "Miss Blackwood, there's someone here who wants to speak with you." She opened the conference room door, and Alex walked in, escorted by 2 agents but not in custody. His hair was disheveled, his usually perfect suit wrinkled, and his eyes held a look of shell-shocked confusion that I had never seen before. "Zara," he said, and his voice broke on my name. "I'm so sorry, you were right about everything, and I wouldn't listen. Dad almost signed away our entire inheritance to criminals, and you're the only reason we still have anything left." I looked at him across the table, this man who had chosen his father's judgment over his wife's warnings just hours earlier, who had dismissed my concerns as emotional hysteria while walking blindly toward financial disaster. "Alex," I said quietly, "I tried to tell you. I begged you to listen, to investigate, to consider the possibility that I might know something you didn't. But you couldn't imagine that your artistic wife might understand business better than your father and his advisors. I know, and I have no excuse for that. I've been a terrible husband, a blind son, and an arrogant fool. But Zara, we can fix this. We can rebuild our marriage, our family, our trust in each other. Now that Kane is gone and Dad understands what almost happened, everything can be different." The earnestness in his voice was heartbreaking, but it was also fundamentally naive. Alex still didn't understand that the problem in our marriage wasn't external circumstances that could be corrected by removing Kane from the equation. The problem was his inability to see me as anything more than a supporting character in his own life story. "Alex," I said gently, "our marriage can't be fixed by external changes. It can only be repaired if you're willing to fundamentally alter how you see me, how you value my opinions, how you balance your loyalty to your family against your commitment to your wife. Are you prepared to do that work?" He nodded eagerly, too eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever it takes. Zara, I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I respect and value everything about you." Agent Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "Miss Blackwood, I'm afraid your wife will be in protective custody for at least the next week while we complete related arrests. You'll have time to consider these conversations more carefully before making any permanent decisions about your future." As Alex was escorted out of the conference room, I realized that the space between us had grown too wide to be bridged by apologies and promises. He was still thinking about our problems in terms of solutions he could implement, changes he could make to win back my affection. He wasn't thinking about the deeper question of whether he was capable of the kind of fundamental personal growth that would be required to build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles. The week in protective custody passed quietly. I stayed in a secure apartment with round-the-clock security, spending my days reviewing testimony for upcoming legal proceedings, and my evenings reading books I had neglected during my years as a Blackwood wife. Agent Chen visited daily to update me on the progress of related arrests, and to prepare me for the media attention that would follow my eventual public emergence. Kane's entire organization has been dismantled, she told me on my last day in protective custody. 17 arrests across 4 states, asset seizures totaling over $400 million, and enough evidence to ensure that Kane himself will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Mrs. Blackwood, what you did didn't just save your family. It protected dozens of other potential victims from similar schemes. The scope of the impact was overwhelming. My decision to fight back against Harold's systematic cruelty had inadvertently exposed a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families and communities for years. The worthless woman who had been dismissed from family photos had become a federal hero whose actions would protect countless strangers from financial devastation. On my first day of freedom, I moved into a furnished apartment in the Pearl District, far from the Blackwood penthouse and the Riverside Motel boat. It was a clean, modern space with large windows overlooking the city, the kind of place where a woman could build a new life without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Nadia called within hours of my address becoming available. The interview committee would like to meet with you tomorrow morning if you're available. They've been following your story in the news, and they're incredibly impressed with your courage and integrity. The job interview felt like a formality. The committee members were more interested in discussing my vision for supporting emerging artists than in evaluating my qualifications, which had been extensively validated by recent media coverage. By the end of the meeting, I had been offered the position as Director of Artist Development for the Pacific Northwest Cultural Initiative, with a salary and benefits package that would provide complete financial independence. When can you asked the committee chair, a distinguished woman in her 60s who had built her own reputation by supporting unconventional artists and innovative cultural programs. Immediately I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Alex called that evening, his first direct contact since our conversation at the FBI office. Zara, I've been in therapy every day since this happened. I'm working with someone who specializes in helping men understand how to be better partners, how to recognize and change patterns of behavior that damage relationships. That's good, Alex. I'm glad you're getting the help you need. I want you to know that I've moved out of the penthouse. I can't live in that space knowing how unhappy it made you, how isolated you felt there. I've rented a small apartment downtown, and I'm learning how to take care of myself without staff or family support. The changes he was describing sounded promising, but they also sounded like performances designed to win back my approval rather than genuine transformations rooted in self-awareness and personal growth. Alex, I'm glad you're making positive changes in your life, but I need you to understand that I'm not waiting for you to become the man I need you to be. I'm building a life that fulfills me regardless of whether our marriage survives this crisis. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. Are you saying it's over between us? I'm saying that I'm not going to sacrifice my own happiness and professional fulfillment to make space for a relationship that requires me to be less than I am. If you want to be part of my future, you'll need to prove that you can love and support the woman I actually am, not the woman you want me to become. 6 months later, Catherine Morrison's book about the Kane investigation became a bestseller, with an entire chapter devoted to my role in exposing the conspiracy. The title was The Worthless Wife: How One Woman's Courage Brought Down a Criminal Empire, and it sparked national conversations about family dynamics, financial abuse, and the systematic dismissal of women's voices in business and legal contexts. I was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing my story with audiences who saw in it reflections of their own struggles against diminishment and erasure. The speaking engagements provided additional income while allowing me to advocate for other women who had been told they were worthless by people who should have valued their contributions. The Pacific Northwest Cultural Initiative flourished under my leadership. We discovered and supported dozens of emerging artists, organized exhibitions that brought national attention to the region's creative community, and established funding programs that provided opportunities for artists from underrepresented backgrounds. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways I had forgotten were possible. Harold was never charged with any crimes related to Kane's conspiracy, but his reputation in the business community was permanently damaged by revelations about his willingness to partner with criminals and his systematic mistreatment of his daughter-in-law. Blackwood Properties survived the crisis, but never regained its former prominence in Portland's real estate market. Harold spent his remaining years as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation and poor judgment. Alex continued therapy and made what appeared to be genuine efforts to address the character flaws that had damaged our marriage. He sent thoughtful letters that demonstrated real insight into his past behavior and sincere commitments to personal growth. But he never pressured me to reconcile, never demanded that I acknowledge his progress or reward his efforts with renewed romantic attention. A year after the arrests, we met for coffee at the same shop where I had first reconnected with my professional identity. Alex looked healthier than he had in years, more relaxed and authentic than the driven businessman I had married. "I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for what you did to save our family, but for everything you've accomplished since then. You've built something beautiful and meaningful, and you did it entirely on your own terms." "Thank you," I said, meaning it genuinely. "I'm proud of the work you've been doing too." Real change is never easy, especially when it requires admitting that fundamental assumptions about yourself were wrong. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued. "I certainly don't expect reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost when I failed to see you clearly, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman you always were, even if I never get another chance to prove that to you direct." As we parted that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the early days of our courtship: genuine affection for Alex as a person rather than resentment toward him as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in my life. Whether that affection would ever develop into something deeper remained to be seen, but for the first time in years the possibility didn't seem entirely impossible. The apartment in the Pearl District became the home I had never had as a Blackwood wife, filled with art from the artists I supported, books that reflected my actual interests, and furnishings chosen for comfort rather than social impression. Friends visited regularly, colleagues stopped by for impromptu planning sessions, and the space buzzed with the kind of creative energy that had been entirely absent from the sterile perfection of the penthouse. On quiet evenings, I sometimes stood at the windows overlooking the city and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place. A year ago, I had been a woman defined entirely by other people's needs and expectations, invisible in family photos, dismissed in business discussions, treated as an inconvenience by the people who should have valued me most. Now I was a woman whose voice was heard in corporate boardrooms and university lecture halls, whose professional judgment was sought by collectors and institutions across the country, whose personal story had inspired thousands of other women to refuse diminishment and demand respect. Harold had called me worthless, and for too long, I had believed him. But worth isn't determined by other people's opinions or validated by external approval. Worth is inherent, unchangeable, and ultimately revealed by how we respond when everything we thought we knew about ourselves is stripped away. The woman who had walked out of Ridgefield Manor with nothing but her dignity had discovered that dignity was enough. Everything else, the career, the recognition, the financial independence, the possibility of genuine love based on mutual respect, had grown from that single seed of self-worth that no amount of systematic cruelty had been able to destroy. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings and exhibitions and speaking engagements, I whispered a thank you to the man who had tried so hard to erase me from his family's story. Harold's worthless daughter-in-law had become exactly the person she was always meant to be, and no one would ever have the power to make her disappear again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.